Text message came in at 11:47 on a Tuesday night, while I was sitting in the back pew of St. Andrew's, watching them lower my oldest friend into the ground the next morning in my head, rehearsing what I would say at her eulogy. I had my phone on silent, but I felt it buzz against my thigh. I figured it was my neighbour asking about the spare key. I figured it could wait. It couldn't. When I finally looked down, I saw my son-in-law's name on the screen. Not my daughter's. His. Transfer $18,000 to this account by Friday, or you won't be seeing those grandchildren again. Your choice. Below that, a routing number, a bank account I didn't recognize. I read it 3 times. Then I set my phone face down on the nightstand, turned off the lamp, and stared at the ceiling until 4 in the morning. I want to tell you that I cried. That would make for a better story, I suppose. But I didn't. I just lay there very still, feeling something cold and clear settle into my chest. Something that felt a lot like the end of pretending. My name is Beatrice. I am 63 years old. I was a middle school librarian for 31 years in Raleigh, North Carolina, and I raised my daughter Fern largely on my own after her father walked out when she was 4. I won't spend much time on him. He's not part of this story. He made himself not part of this story a long time ago. What I will tell you is that Fern was the kind of child who made you feel like you had done something right. She was curious and warm, and she had this laugh that could fill a whole room. She got a full scholarship to NC State. She called me every Sunday without fail. When I had my hip replacement 2 years ago, she drove up from Wilmington and stayed for a week, sleeping on my couch, making me soup I didn't ask for, watching old game shows with me at midnight because I couldn't sleep from the pain medication. That was 2 years ago. That feels like a different world now. She met her husband. I'll call him Deacon, because that's what he fancied himself, the kind of man who talked about God a lot and did very little to justify it. At a work conference in Charlotte. She was 34. She'd never really brought anyone home before, not seriously, and I think she was so relieved to finally have someone that she skipped over a few things she should have looked at more carefully. I noticed them. I didn't say enough. That's on me. The first time I met Deacon, he shook my hand too long, told me he'd heard so much about me, and then spent the next 2 hours talking exclusively about himself, his business ideas, his connections, his vision for where he and Fern were headed. Fern sat beside him with this bright, slightly exhausted smile. The way you smile when you're hoping someone you love will make a good impression, and they are not quite doing it. After he went to the bathroom, I touched her hand across the table and said, "He sure does have a lot of plans." She laughed. "He's driven, Mama. He just gets excited." I nodded. I poured more sweet tea. I let it go. They got engaged 8 months later. The wedding was beautiful. I will give him that. Outdoor ceremony in the mountains, wildflowers everywhere, Fern in a dress that made her look like something out of a dream. I stood in the front row and cried, the good kind of tears, the kind you save up for a moment you knew was coming and feared and hoped for all at once. Then they moved in with me. I want to be precise about how that happened because it matters. Fern called me on a Thursday evening, about 3 weeks after they got back from their honeymoon in Costa Rica. She said Deacon's new business venture had hit a delay. Something with investors, something with the timing. They needed a soft landing for just a few months, maybe 4 or 5, while he got things sorted out. She said, "I know this is a lot to ask, Mama. Just say no if it's too much." I said it wasn't too much. I meant it when I said it. I want to be honest about something else. My house is not a small house. I bought it in 2008 at the bottom of the market, with money my mother left me and 30 years of careful saving. It's a 4-bedroom Victorian on a quiet street with a wraparound porch and a garden I have tended every spring since I moved in. It is the thing I am most proud of in this world, after Fern herself. I have the deed. I paid it off in 2019. That house is mine in a way that very few things in a woman's life ever really are. 4 or 5 months turned into 9. 9 turned into 14. Somewhere along the way, it stopped being a favor I was doing and started being something else entirely. The first thing that shifted was small. Deacon started referring to my home as the house rather than your mother's place. A tiny thing. I filed it away. Then he started having his business calls in my study without asking. The door closed for hours at a time, while I sat in the living room with nowhere quiet to read. Then he rearranged the kitchen, moved the spice rack I'd had in the same spot for 15 years, reorganized the pantry in a way that made no sense to me, threw out a cast iron skillet that had belonged to my grandmother because he said it was taking up space. I asked him very calmly to please check with me before making changes to the kitchen. He looked at me with this patient, slightly pitying expression, the way you look at someone whose feelings you're about to explain to them, and said, "Beatrice, we're all trying to make this work for everyone. I'm just trying to be helpful." Fern was standing at the sink with her back to me. She didn't say anything. That was the moment I should have sat them both down. I know that now. Instead I said, "Of course," and went to check on my garden. The next 14 months were a slow accumulation of moments exactly like that one. He started inviting his friends over without asking, a poker game that went until 2 in the morning on a weeknight, twice a month, in my living room. He told Fern that my habit of watching the evening news at 7 was disruptive to their routine, and she started suggesting gently that I watch it in my room. He questioned my grocery choices, my utility bills, the cost of my internet plan. He pointed out more than once that I was retired and not really generating income, as if that had any bearing on whose name was on the mortgage. And Fern, my Fern. She started translating for him. "He doesn't mean it like that, Mama. He's just stressed about work, Mama. He's trying to contribute, you know how he is." She became his interpreter, his apologist, his soft landing the same way I had been hers. There was a night about 10 months in when I was sitting on my porch after dinner, just watching the fireflies, and Fern came out and sat beside me the way she used to when she was little. For a few minutes neither of us said anything. Then she said, "I know this isn't easy." Then she said, "I know this isn't easy." I looked at her. I said, "Do you?" She looked away. "He won't be forever." "Okay," I said. That was the entirety of the conversation. We went back inside and watched television, and I made us both chamomile tea, and we did not talk about it again. I'm a person who kept her feelings in a jar, tightly lidded. Because I grew up learning that nobody particularly wanted to hear what was in the jar. I am working on that, but back then, I still believed, somewhere underneath everything, that if I was patient enough and generous enough and quiet enough, things would work themselves out. I had raised my daughter to be a good person. Good people, I thought, eventually come around. I did start documenting, though. Not because I had a plan, more because it's what librarians do. We record things, we preserve them, we believe in the paper trail. Every incident, I wrote it down in a spiral notebook I kept in the back of my closet. The dates, the words, the way Fern looked when it happened. I didn't know what I was saving it for. I just knew I needed somewhere to put it. The months rolled on. Deacon's business, whatever it was, and I genuinely never understood it. Something about investment consulting and real estate development. Words that sounded expensive and produced nothing visible, kept having setbacks. Investors who were almost on board. Deals that were very close. He stopped working a regular job entirely about 6 months after they moved in, which meant that Fern, who was an occupational therapist and earned a perfectly respectable living, was supporting both of them. And they were living in my house for free. I started watching my own bank account more carefully. I should tell you something about my finances because it matters for what comes next. After my mother passed 8 years ago, she left me a life insurance policy and a small portfolio she'd been quietly building for 20 years. I've never talked about it openly. It's not how I was raised. You don't discuss money, especially not with people who might want some. What I will say is that I am not wealthy in any flashy sense. I drive a 2017 Honda. I shop at the same grocery store I've shopped at for 15 years. I get my hair done once a month at a salon run by a woman I've known since the early 90s. But I am comfortable. Solidly, carefully, quietly comfortable. And Deacon had no idea. He thought I was a retired librarian living off a pension. He thought I was one unexpected medical bill away from needing him. He thought that. which is part of why what he did made sense to him, I suppose. My dear friend Mabel. We've been friends since our daughters were in the same kindergarten class 30 years ago. Passed away on a Monday in March from a second stroke that came 3 weeks after the first. I had been at the hospital with her family as much as I could, driving back and forth from Raleigh, and I was exhausted and heartbroken in that specific way you are, when someone you've known for 30 years is gone, and the world just keeps going like nothing happened. I came home from the hospital the evening after she passed and found Deacon's friends in my living room again. Pizza boxes on my coffee table. The television on at a volume I could hear from the driveway. I stood in the doorway for a long moment. Deacon looked up and said, "Hey, Beatrice, you mind keeping it down if you're going upstairs? We're in the middle of something." I went upstairs. I sat on the edge of my bed. I opened that spiral notebook and I wrote everything down. The eulogy was on Thursday. It was a beautiful service. Mabel would have approved of the flower arrangements. She had opinions about flowers. And I was doing all right until I sat back down in the pew and took out my phone to turn the ringer back on. That's when I saw the text from Deacon. "Transfer $18,000 to this account by Friday, or you won't be seeing those grandchildren again. Your choice." I should explain the grandchildren part because it requires context. Fern had delivered my first and only grandchild, a boy, 14 months old at the time, whom I will call by his nickname, Bug. Because that is what I called him from the day he was born, and I am not ready to use his real name in a story like this one. About 5 months after they moved in, Bug changed everything and nothing simultaneously. He made the whole situation more complicated, because now there was someone to protect, someone to stay for, someone who looked at me with his mother's eyes and reached for me with both arms every time I walked into the room. Deacon knew that. He used it. I sat in the parking lot of the church for 45 minutes. I read the text 14 times. I thought about what my friend Mabel would have said. She would have said, "Beatrice, you have been letting that man stand on your neck for over a year. You know what you need to do." I drove home. I went straight to my study. Deacon was out, Fern was at work, Bug was at daycare, and I made 3 phone calls. The first was to my attorney, a woman I had used for my estate planning and who knew my full financial picture. I read her the text message. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Beatrice, what you have here is written evidence of attempted extortion. I want you to screenshot that, email it to me right now, and do not respond to it. Not one word." I did exactly that. The second call was to a family law attorney she recommended, a woman who specialized in grandparents' rights in North Carolina. I won't go into every detail of that conversation, but what I will tell you is that North Carolina does have grandparents' rights statutes, and that the text message in my hand was, as it turned out, a significant piece of evidence. The third call was to Fern. She didn't pick up. I left a voicemail. I said, "Honey, I need you to come home tonight before dinner. Just you. I need to talk to you about something, and I need you to hear me out before you say anything." She called back in 20 minutes. She sounded cautious. "Is everything okay?" "No," I said, "but it's going to be." When Fern walked through the door at 5:30, I was sitting at the kitchen table. I had made coffee. I had the notebook in front of me. I had my phone with the text message open, face down, next to my coffee cup. I asked her to sit down. I slid the phone across the table. I watched her face while she read it. I watched the color drain out of it. I watched her read it twice, 3 times. I watched her set the phone down very carefully, the way you set down something you're not sure how to hold. "Mama," she said. "I know," I said. I don't know. "I believe you," I said. And I did. I knew my daughter. But I need you to understand that this changes things. This changes everything. She started to cry. I reached across the table and held her hand, and I let her cry. And I did not cry myself because I had done that already, alone, in the parking lot of St. Andrews. When she could talk again, I told her about the attorneys. I told her about the documentation, all 14 months of it. I opened the notebook, and I showed her the dates. the incidents, the words he had used. I watched her face move through something as she read, something complicated and painful that I recognized because I had felt it myself, the rearrangement of a story you'd been telling yourself, the pieces settling into a shape you didn't want but couldn't argue with anymore. She said, "I didn't know it was this bad." I said, "I know you didn't. I didn't tell you enough. That's partly on me." She said, "He's going to say I'm choosing you over him." I said, "I know, and I need you to decide who you're choosing." She looked at me for a long time. I held very still. I had done everything I could do. The rest of it was hers. "Where is he now?" she asked. "I don't know," I said, "but he'll be back." She wiped her face with the back of her hand. She said, "Okay." Just that one word, but I heard everything inside it. Deacon came home at 7:15. Fern and I were still sitting at the kitchen table. He walked in, saw us both, and did that thing he did. That slight recalibration, the easy smile coming up like a screen. "Hey," he said, "what are you two up to?" Fern said, "Sit down." He looked at me. I looked back at him, and I didn't say anything, and I didn't look away. He sat down. Fern put the phone on the table between them. She said, "Explain this." "I won't tell you everything he said in the next 30 minutes, because some of it is still too exhausting to recount. There was a version of events where he was protecting the family. There was a version where I had never made him feel welcome. There was a version where the financial pressure had made him do something he didn't mean. He would never actually follow through on it. She had to know that. There was a lot of God talk. There were tears. His that I noticed did not appear until it became clear that Fern was not taking his side. I said very little. I had said most of what I needed to say to Fern. I let her lead. At the end of it, I said one thing. I said, "You've been living in my house for 14 months. I've asked very little, but I'm asking something now. I want you both out by the end of the month. I'll help you find a place. I'll give you 30 days, but this is my house and I need it back." Deacon said, "You can't just." "I can," I said. "And I am. The lease, since there is no lease, since you never paid rent, is terminated. I've spoken to an attorney. You'll want to do the same." He looked at Fern. He was waiting for her to argue. She didn't. The next month was not easy. I won't pretend it was. There were nights Fern slept in her old room, while Deacon stayed in the guest room down the hall, and the house had a particular kind of quiet that hurt. There were arguments I heard through the walls and didn't intervene in. There were mornings Bug sat in his high chair in my kitchen, banging a spoon, blissfully unaware, and I would make him oatmeal with blueberries, and sit beside him, and try to just be there, in that moment with him. Fern filed for legal separation 6 weeks after that night. I found out when she sat down at the kitchen table. She was back in her old room by then, just her and Bug temporarily, and told me quietly, like she was reporting something that had already happened in another life. I said, "How are you feeling?" She said, "Like I wasted 3 years." I said, "You didn't waste them. You learned something that cost you, and that's different." She leaned her head on my shoulder, the way she used to when she was 12. We sat there for a while. The evening news came on at 7. I watched it in the living room. Deacon, to my knowledge, moved in with a cousin in Greensboro. The business venture he'd been describing for 14 months never materialized. The text message he sent me, the one that was supposed to be a threat, the one he thought would bring me to my knees, became part of the family court documentation, and it did not help his case in negotiations around custody and visitation. What he thought was a weapon turned out to be a full confession, in writing with a timestamp. He never knew I had an attorney before he sat down at that table. He never knew I'd been writing everything down. He never knew, because I never told him, that I could have bought and sold whatever he thought he was building 10 times over without feeling it. He thought he was negotiating with a woman who had no options. He was wrong about every part of that. It has been 11 months since that night. Fern is doing well, better than well, actually. She found a small house for rent about 4 miles from mine. Close enough that Bug comes to me on Saturday mornings, and we do puzzles, and I let him eat more blueberry pancakes than is probably strictly advisable. She got a promotion at the therapy practice she works at. She started going to a counselor, which I think is the best decision she's made in a long time. We talk on the phone most evenings, sometimes about nothing, sometimes about everything. We have been finding our way back to each other, the two of us, the way we were before a man we both wanted, too much to see clearly, came and stood between us. My garden did well this spring. The dahlias came up especially full. I don't know what I did differently, but they came up in colours I hadn't seen before, deep red and a kind of burnt orange that looked like something on fire in the early morning light. I would go out there before the heat came on with my coffee and just stand in it. Mabel always said I had good hands for growing things. I still have the spiral notebook. I haven't thrown it away, not because I need it anymore, but because I spent 14 months filling it up, and I think it deserves to stay somewhere for a while. A record. Proof that I was paying attention even when I wasn't speaking up. I paid attention, I wrote it down, and when the moment came, I was ready. That is the whole of it. That is my story. I have my house, and my garden, and my Saturday mornings with my grandson, and my daughter, 4 miles down the road, who calls me on evenings when she doesn't have much to say, and calls anyway. I have myself. That turns out to be enough. I've thought a lot about that spiral notebook. 14 months of dates and words and small moments that didn't look like much on their own but added up to something undeniable when you put them all in a row. I didn't start keeping it because I was smart. I started keeping it because I was hurting and I needed somewhere to put it. But somewhere along the way, the act of writing things down became the act of refusing to pretend they hadn't happened. And that refusal, that quiet, private refusal, is what saved me in the end. What Deacon never understood is that the actions you take in private always catch up with you in public. He sent that text because he believed I was cornered. He had spent 14 months watching me say, "Of course, and I understand, and it's fine," and he mistook my patience for weakness. He mistook my silence for an empty account, in every sense of the word. When you build a life on taking advantage of someone's goodness, you stop being able to imagine that the goodness has a backbone inside it. That was his miscalculation, not a small one. And Fern, my daughter, who I love without reservation, she had her own reckoning to face. She is not a villain in this story. She is a woman who wanted something to work so badly that she stopped seeing it clearly. I know that feeling. I've had it myself. The difference between wisdom and wishful thinking is usually just time and pain, and she paid for both. What I'm proud of is that when I finally laid everything on the table, she looked at it. She didn't look away. That took something real, a kind of honesty that is harder than people give it credit for, because it required her to sit with being wrong for a while before she could move forward. That's not nothing. That's actually everything. I spent a lot of years keeping my feelings in a jar because I thought being undemanding was the same thing as being strong. It isn't. Real strength is knowing when something is wrong and saying so, clearly, without apology, and being willing to hold that line even when it costs you something. I didn't do that soon enough. I let things go on too long because I told myself I was being patient and generous, when really I was just afraid of conflict and hoping things would fix themselves. They don't fix themselves, they compound. What I know now is this: character isn't what you claim about yourself. It's what you do when you think no one is watching, when you believe the other person has no options, when the pressure is on and the easy thing is also the wrong thing. Deacon showed me his character in a text message sent from a church parking lot the day after my best friend died. And I showed him mine at a kitchen table 3 hours later, with a notebook and a phone and 31 years of knowing exactly whose house I was sitting in. I have my grandson on Saturday mornings. I have my daughter 4 miles down the road. I have dahlias this year in colours I'd never grown before. You get back what you put in. It just doesn't always come back from the direction you expected.